Well, good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here this morning. I started my academic career here in England back in the mid-'80s at Oxford and had a chance to do a lot of work both with the then government and the opposition that it has been a real pleasure to see come to fruition over the last couple of decades. And so it's been fun to track this from the other side of the pond and come back whenever I can get the chance. I want to thank Nicola and all of the staff and leadership at the UUK. It's been a wonderful opportunity to be here. I should say a somewhat intimidating group with the collective leadership of all of the UK's universities, but also a great pleasure to be part of it, and also to thank Sir Alan, our host. I had a chance to meet him last night at dinner and really enjoy the conversation and loving the university here. So what I want to do in my few minutes to start out this morning is really to tie into the conference theme around enhancing diversity. This is obviously a big theme in higher ed in the States, but my own work over the last 25 years in higher ed has actually focused more on global comparisons. And so what I want to talk about is the changing world of global higher education, and what I think it brings in terms of what I think will be some of the most interesting opportunities as well as challenges for the leaders of the UK's and other universities around the world in the coming decades. So a colleague, Richard Freeman at Harvard, has spoke of this last decade as the one of the great doubling. The fact that if we look across the world in terms of the supply of graduates, we've seen a really unprecedented phenomenon of a huge increase in the supply of graduates. And one of the challenges that poses for all of you and your graduates is that that growth has been happening at a greater rate than the growth in the demand for high-skilled jobs. And so it's posing some real challenges in the graduate labor market we can talk more about. It's also meant that there's a huge surge in both the demand for your universities, but also new potential partners and competitors in some of the world's leading other emerging economies around the world. And I've particularly focused in my work on India and China, and I'll talk with you a bit more about the tremendous changes that have been happening there. A third element I want to talk about that's changing the way we think about education is the role of technology in that, and particularly this new emerging phenomena of MOOCs, or massively open online courses, and what that might mean for higher ed. And then finally, the shifts in who funds higher ed, and that you have obviously gone through particularly strongly here, and that we heard yesterday about from the minister, and the implications of that for us as we move forward. So if you look at the data over what's happened across the industrialized and emerging economy world over the last few decades, what you've seen is that there's been a tremendous growth in skill supply, but that the growth in the number of high-skilled jobs has been at a much slower pace. And so what that's meant, combined with the Great Recession that we had in 2008, from which we've seen only a slow economic recovery, is that there are just not as many jobs for new graduates as there have been in the past. And there's an increasing intensity of that. We're seeing that particularly felt in some fields in the States, for example, law, where applications were down over 30% in the last couple of years because the supply of new lawyers relative to the demand, not just in terms of the uptick in the economy, but also huge increases in competition, outsourcing of those jobs is really making for a very, very different labor market. The biggest growth we're seeing in the supply of graduates has been coming in really an unprecedented way from countries like India and China. Countries which a few years ago had only a small percent of their population in higher ed and have really exploded over the last 2 decades. I want to talk to you about these two systems because they've been a real focus for my own work over the last few years in thinking about them in the way that the work I did in Britain back in the late 80s, we talked about the notion of a low-skill equilibrium that Britain needed to break out of, where you had a mix of low supply of graduates, low supply of high-skilled labor, but not that many jobs that were demanding them. That was really the situation in India and China entering the 90s. But they have seen an aggressive campaign to move up in terms of the supply of talented labor in both countries because they see it as absolutely central to their economic development. And of course, you've seen this in the demand for your own universities from many of their top graduates. But what it's meant is that in today's global economy, it can be a very unstable situation if we don't meet the aspirations, the demands of those graduates. And we're seeing that perhaps most notably right now in the Middle East, where many of the leaders of the opposition that we're seeing are people who have gotten good educations, but have not seen any economic opportunity for themselves and feel stifled in terms of what they can grasp within their own economies. So let's talk a little bit more about what's happening in China and India. China has established itself as now the world's largest economy on some measures, second largest in others, by really becoming the leader in low-cost manufacturing. That, in almost every sector of the economy, has been the basis for going from a relatively poor economy to one that today is among the most rapidly growing in the world. And the way it's done that is by really moving up the value chain significantly as it's investing more in middle and higher skills across the economy, and particularly heavily in things like new patents, R&D, creating research universities at a historically unprecedented rate, literally building for many years a new research university at the equivalent of one every month for a decade. And this innovation strategy is paying off in terms of now world number one in terms of patents issued per year. Now, many of those are yet to be tested in terms of the quality of what underlies them, but they're seeing huge increase in publications in the top journals around the world, tremendous pressure on professors and on universities to maximize on those kinds of measures, and as I'm sure you're experiencing, an outreach from this to partner with leading universities around the world. What that has led to in terms of the percent of the population getting degrees is really dramatic. Starting back in 1990, only 3% of the Chinese population went into tertiary education. Today, that's a third, and it's growing even more so. And so you've gone from very, very elite system, only a small percentage, to now truly, like we're seeing in the UK and across Europe, a mass higher education system with opportunities for almost every talented person who wants to go, if they have relatively modest means, to be able to do it in one of the national universities. What we're seeing in this second stage of Chinese emphasis on higher ed, though, is an emphasis from quantity. Can we get more places for people to go to university, to quality? Can we improve what's being done there, start to change the pedagogy, and focus on actually having what they're set a clear goal through the 2011 scheme, to have many of the world's leading research universities, leading deliverers of education in China that others will want to come to and not just offer great things for their population. Now, the UK has been a real leader in this area in terms of partnering with Chinese universities. Institutions like Nottingham and Liverpool were among the first Western universities to set up campuses in China, and the results for their graduates have been hugely impressive in terms of where they've been able to then go into leading graduate programs around the world. The US is now following suit with universities like NYU and others going there. We're seeing huge incentives from the Chinese government to set up there. When I was at Rutgers before I went on leave, I actually spent a lot of my last year there working on a plan for a 10,000 student university campus in China, a joint venture, as all of them are, but a fascinating exercise in going through and thinking about if someone were to write you a check for $350 million and you could build any university you'd want, what would it look like? How would you go about doing it, and how would you think about innovating there? And so a really interesting thing to look at. And why are they doing this? Why are they offering so much to bring people there? Well, I think there are several reasons. One is they want to study, as they've done in every other sector of the economy, what's working, what's not, and how can they innovate and learn from us. They want to establish lower cost options for their students instead of going to the UK or the US to study and get that degree, to do it in China, to keep that currency there, but also to keep those minds there so that they'll stay there. And eventually, they would like to become the leading destination for students from all around the world because they see that as part of their greater economic and, frankly, strategic strategy for becoming a world superpower. Despite all of this progress, though, if you look closely, many skill issues remain across the Chinese education system. What you see is there's a big mismatch between supply and demand. So while we may worry, at least in the short term in the UK, about are there more graduates than there are good jobs for graduates, this has become a huge issue in China because of that very rapid growth, which frankly has been happening more quickly than managers and companies have been adjusting their strategies. So they don't see as much demand for these graduates as those coming out, and that's exacerbated by the fact that the pedagogy in Chinese universities has really not evolved too much. If you go there, if you sit in lectures, you'll see literally people will still be reading a paper for an hour, which in today's Twitter generation and cell phones, I can assure you doesn't keep people's rapt attention for very long. Enterprises also have not had as much incentive historically to move up the value chain in terms of higher price, higher quality strategies, though we are starting to see that because China is no longer the low-cost source for going to have things manufactured. As wages have moved up there, as costs of production have increased, we're seeing places like Vietnam, Bangladesh, the Philippines, others emerging, and China is seeking to be more the higher value-added producer for across Asia. The other thing we're seeing is that China has a huge inward migration problem. So the scale when you talk about China can be quite mind-boggling, but in China you've seen a migration of 500 million people from the countryside to the cities over the last 2 decades. And under Chinese law, not all of the children of these migrants have full rights to education in the new cities where they're living. And so that's creating huge issues in terms of access within their own system for the most talented of this new migrant labor force. So when we look to the future of China's systems, I think there are a number of questions that we still do not know the answers to as we think about how will it evolve. First, how quickly will the strategies, will they be successful in moving into higher end niches like high-speed rail, like solar, like biotechnology, like advanced manufacturing? Huge progress already, but will they emerge as world leaders in these fields with the accompanying demands for them? Can a country become an innovation leader without having freedom in newspapers and media, in political realm in the same way? We've seen efforts at this, but whether that can be sustained, it creates real tensions within China, as I'm sure many of you who've been there have experienced in terms of how this evolves. But what we are seeing is among the students, if you spend time in Chinese universities, amazing ways in which they're getting access to information, even if the normal routes are blocked. And so it creates, I think, over time, some really interesting tensions within the system. I think there's a major risk in China, as we saw in Japan in the last decades, in terms of what happens if the real estate bubble on which so much of the wealth of the economy exists, if that were to pop. That could have all sorts of ripple effects, including the supply of Chinese students who could afford to come and study in the UK and the US. There are major reform movements underway that are still in their early phases, like intellectual property, like trade union reform, which again will have big implications for how China's economy and the skills sector evolve over the coming decades. And then finally, we have a huge, interesting sociological experiment going on, which is China, as I'm sure you're aware, instituted in a very effective way the one-child policy. It stemmed a huge growth in population which was unsustainable. It's now eased up on it because it was in fact so effective that they are worrying about the demographics going forward. But what it means is you have an entire generation that the Chinese refer to as the golden bowl or spoiled generation, the little emperors and empresses, who've all grown up with 4 grandparents and 2 parents, all focused on their success, investing in their success, investing in their education, but in a true hothouse environment. And that, I think, is going to be interesting to see how it plays out as this generation becomes industry leaders and political leaders. So this is the demographic effects of that generation, and we're just starting to see it. The dramatic fall off in the number of school leavers from China, and so that huge growth we saw in terms of the percent participating in higher ed is only going to accelerate because there are far fewer young people coming out of the school system. So as a percentage, to fill those places, even more will be going into higher ed. But what it also means for the economy as a whole is that China is the first country that we've seen that's becoming old before it becomes rich. And in this sense, I mean rich not on the whole economy sense, but rich in the per capita GDP sense. So China has not built a welfare state. It has only just instituted a national health care system, and yet it now has a demographic profile that looks very much like the UK's or the US's or European economies as a result of that one-child generation. And so they're trying to figure out who is going to pay for the people who are now retiring in record numbers when there's only 1 child for each 2 parents. India, by contrast, is the exact reverse. So if China looks a bit like the children's book, The Little Snake, the snake that swallowed the elephant, India is what they call the demographic dividend, or a huge flat pyramid, 550 million people under the age of 25. So potentially the biggest workforce for the world in the 21st century, a huge potential talent pool to fill the world's universities, but also a huge challenge for a country which is much poorer than China and still faces many, many obstacles in its education system. One of the fun things about studying China and India is, in many ways, they are the yin and yang. They are the reverse or mirror images of each other. So if China's success has been predominantly in low-cost manufacturing and moving up from there, India's success globally has really been built around delivering of knowledge-based services, of becoming the business process outsourcer or the call center or the software programmers of the world. And that's fit well with its economy because those are things which don't require huge capital investment. They don't necessarily require even that the lights be on 24/7. What it requires is having good talent, hardworking talent. And India has both the benefits but also the threats from being the world's largest democracy. As we just saw in its recent elections, they have far more people turning out to vote than any other country in the world when they hold an election. It went very smoothly, but they also have all of the challenges at the local, state, and national levels that come with a quite messy democracy in terms of actually being able to mobilize resources in terms of national priorities. So when we look at what's happening in India's education, what we see is, as has been mirrored in the US and many other countries, a growing gap between educational haves and have-nots, which poses a real challenge for the system. The government's solution to this has been quite controversial. It's been an extreme form of affirmative action. So they basically said, well, we will deal with the lack of access. We will deal with the diversity questions by reserving half the slots in our top universities, in all of the public universities, for disadvantaged castes and social class groups. And that, to the middle class that's working hard to get those places, may mean that they don't have access to a place, and it has caused major challenges, controversy across the Indian electorate. So India's skills paradox, I would argue, is that on the one hand, you're seeing countries around the world, like the Philippines, like Malaysia, like African nations, coming to India rather than to China to study how have they done it, how have they been able to be so successful in these knowledge services, because they see that as a model they can replicate far more easily than China. And yet, as I will show you, India, in almost every aspect of its education system, has severe challenges in terms of meeting the aspirations, the needs of its population. So how has India been able to be seen as a skills success story while having these challenges? Well, I would argue it comes down to what I call the 3 E's. Namely, first of all, an elite examination system, similar in some ways with the origins of the British system in India, to the A-level or the Oxbridge board system, where you have a national exam still very well respected that all of the Indian students must go through. And that sorts the top talent from over 1 billion people across the country. You then have a set of elite educational institutions like the IITs and the IIMs and some of the top federal universities that these students can go to. And finally, you have the benefits of that elite, in an educational sense, speaking English in a way that gives them more access to global corporations and global investment than you see in China or Korea or some of their Asian competitors. Now, they also speak 29 other languages, more than 1 million people in India speaking them, so it's an extremely diverse country in that respect. But the fact that they all have that as a common bond, I think, helps them to a great deal in the global economic sense. But what we see if you look at India as a whole is not just trailing China, not just trailing Europe and the US in terms of education, but in terms of other developing nations, still far fewer people in India not making it just to university, but even completing the end of primary education and going into secondary education. Where we've seen huge growth in India is in the areas where you've seen private investment to grow engineering and management schools. So you've seen an explosion in this within higher ed in the Indian system. The challenge, though, is that the data suggests that many of the people getting those degrees are not employable. So what you see is that the graduates are coming out, they're getting the paper, but many of them are not learning things that employers actually value. And so it's important to them to be graduates, it's highly esteemed, but there's a huge opportunity to improve the quality of what's being offered there. We also see real challenges in their vocational and education system, so only 3% coming out with recognized technical skills. And that's because, again, what those schools are providing often is not meeting the needs of employers. And we see relatively low levels of investment in ongoing education and training outside of India's elite companies. So major skill challenges that the country faces. When I began the work on India and China, I was pretty depressed about India in the sense that when you looked at that scale, 550 million people rapidly coming through the education system and what it would cost, that they didn't have the resources necessary to make the changes needed in time to help this demographic dividend and capitalize on it. What I'm now convinced by is that it's actually not a resource problem. That what you see in India is where the market is allowed to work, where you mobilize a combination of state and private investment, that you can make tremendous progress. And one need only go and look at what's happened there with cell phones and digitalization to see how even in remote villages this can work. But unfortunately, the way in which the governance has existed, the way in which the education system has been structured is preventing this thus far from happening in the education sector. And so I think really the challenges are going to be, can this new government harness the potential that exists there and the demand for folks to put in new models that will unleash this opportunity. And one example of this would be, up until now, India has not allowed foreign universities to partner and set up in India in the same way that China, Korea, other surrounding countries have. And so whether they embrace that, whether they open up and seek not to just let others in and take over, but to partner and work together, I think will have huge impact over the next few years in terms of whether India can address these challenges. So now let me turn to where I'm based in the US and some of the challenges and opportunities we see. Unfortunately, the US has really, I think, in terms of this issue, the theme of the conference around diversity and access, has really lost its leadership position. Coming out of World War II, the US was the first country in the world to create a truly mass higher ed system, to say to all of its people, higher ed is the ticket to a middle class or better existence. It's an opportunity for all to go beyond the class system and really have equal access. But what we've seen is that the US is the only one of the major industrialized countries where that promise is no longer being realized, where it is no longer the case that young people are more likely than their parents to have gotten a college degree. And so the US, since the 1980s, has really stagnated on this dimension, while other countries have advanced rapidly. And so while I would argue we still have many of the world's leading research universities, many of the best educational opportunities in the world, if you measure it in terms of the percent of young people going and getting a degree, the US went from first to 16th, and it's falling. And that, I think, is a true national crisis that we face. This is reflected in the growing focus in the US on what we call the undermatching problem, or the growth in inequality in the system. So in the US, if you're born in a wealthy household, the odds are very likely that you're going to go to the best college or university for you in terms of your innate ability. If you're born in the lower quartile in terms of income, fewer than 10%, only 8% apply to even more than one higher ed institution. So most of those who are going to higher ed at all are going to whatever is their nearest local university, rather than thinking about how can I get to the best place that will maximize my talents. And so a big part of what we're trying to do at American Honors and what others are trying to do is address this undermatching problem. How do we help talented students of whatever income bracket get to the best universities that they might capitalize on? A big reason for the challenge in the US, when you look at it in comparative terms, is cost. Right? We heard this alluded to yesterday by the minister when he was answering a question. In the US, we've seen a huge growth in the costs of higher education. It's now $60,000 a year or more if you count all costs, living, room, board, travel, to go to the elite universities. Now, there's generous financial aid available to those who need it, but what you see is that sticker price has a huge deterrent effect, particularly on those who are first generation or lower and middle income. And it poses real challenges in terms of people's ability to complete their degrees. And so the challenge in the US is not that people aren't starting higher ed. Nearly 2/3 have some college. The problem is people haven't been able to finish, which is a combination of their readiness, but also their financial ability to complete their degree. So if you look at the UK in contrast with this, it's really dramatic how much change there's been since I was here in the mid-'80s. So when I did this early work on the low-skill equilibrium, the UK had only just over 10% going to university. Today, as you know, it's up over a third getting a degree, and what's been really impressive is that the government, that you have been able to do this while maintaining high quality and relatively low attrition rates in a comparative context. But of course, there's no room for complacency because of the data I showed, because of the advances that other nations are making around the world. While the UK today is one of the world's, if not the world's, leading higher ed system, it does face real competitors, real challenges, as well as real opportunities going forward. And so let's talk, just to conclude, about what those are, and then I'd love to open it up for questions, discussion on any of the points I've raised. To me, the most gratifying thing in looking at the UK data is not just to see the overall increase in those attaining a degree, but that actually, unlike the US, you've been able to do it by lessening inequality, by using the bursaries to offset the increase in fees so that more, rather than fewer people who are talented but from the lower socioeconomic groups are gaining access to a university degree. When we look at how the higher ed landscape is changing around the world, what I would argue is we need to think about it along three different dimensions. So historically, most of us, when we've thought about the choice of higher ed, have thought about it in terms of educational equality or brand. How strong as I am as a student, what type of place, what type of degree do I want to study, and where is the best place I can go to find that? But increasingly, particularly as we look at more adult learners, more part-time learners, which demographically are likely to make up more and more of the higher ed cohort, what we see is that people are making choices on several other dimensions. They're looking at convenience, flexibility. If I have a family, if I'm working, what are the easiest ways, the best ways for me to study? And then they're also thinking about affordability. As more of the costs of getting a degree are being put on the individual, in reflecting the fact that they will also get the lifetime benefits of that, what are they going to be able to afford, and is there a good value for money on that? And so I think it's across those three dimensions that you want to think about, where is my institution positioned? How do I fit in? Who am I serving in these different domains? And what we're seeing is interesting new models emerging along these different dimensions. Perhaps the most radical of these, and that was a very big focus just a year ago, was the move toward MOOCs, or massive open online courses. If you think about it, the truly radical things about MOOCs is that for the first time, you have something that offers all three of those dimensions. So you have the world's best universities, many of the leading brands around the world, now offering some of their best professors, offering courses that anyone can take anywhere in the world who has access to the internet, and most of them are free. So you have all three of the dimensions satisfied. Now you have significant challenges, of course, with MOOCs delivery. We know that the number of people completing them is very low. We know that most of the people who complete them already had a degree when they started it. But we're seeing interesting second generation, I would argue, experiments with it in terms of things like Georgia Tech, one of the leading technical universities in the US, now offering an $8,000 MOOC-based master's degree, something that was almost impossible to contemplate the faculty approving even a couple of years ago. You see a movement among many universities to start to flip the classroom, recognizing that the traditional lecture format has not been working so well in terms of pedagogy, and thinking about how can we use this technology so we more effectively use the scarce time, the expensive time we have together to maximize learning. I must admit, as I've been writing the checks for my son who's now finishing up at Harvard, it's quite frightening to think how many of his courses he's taking in the same way that people are taking them for free, except he's doing it from his dorm room rather than in India or Vietnam or somewhere else around the world. Now he's gaining all of the benefits of being with other students from Harvard, of the extracurricular activities, of being able to go and visit with those professors and TAs, which you don't get if you're a MOOC. But the actual lectures themselves, he finds, more often than not, are more effective to do that way. And frankly, no one is sure where this is heading. This is perhaps nowhere better illustrated than at Harvard, where they're having a very public debate between two of the leading professors in their business school, Michael Porter, who literally wrote the textbook on corporate strategy on business strategy, and Clay Christensen, who wrote the very influential work on disruptive innovation and new technologies, who are duking it out as to what online strategy Harvard Business School should adopt. Should it be incremental and gradual and supplementing their core brand, the Porter School, or should it be the Clay Christensen School, which says if we don't radically disrupt our own model, someone else is going to come and do it to us? And so it will be interesting to see how these and other debates play out. We're also seeing new models emerge, like the Western Governors Association. This is one formed by the leaders of many of the states in the western part of the US, but has now emerged and gone into other markets like the Midwest, central parts of the US. And this is a competency-based model, an online education model for both undergrad and graduate degrees, but it's one which starts by accrediting prior learning and then offering people a low-price, pay-as-you-go model, taking as much and moving as rapidly as you can through the system and doing it in a way that allows people, particularly working adults, to get degrees quickly and at a relatively low cost. And it is spread very rapidly and quite influentially across a number of states. As you heard in the introduction, I've taken a leave from Rutgers to join a new organization. It's called American Honors, and I should add, because it came up at the dinner conversation last night, when we say honors in the US, we don't mean honors in the sense of a UK honors degree, but what we mean is an honors program, as you would find in many state universities in the US, which is where you create a separate program for some of your better academic students within a school or within a college or university with your best professors, with small classes, where the students are very actively engaged in their own learning, in doing research, in working in interdisciplinary ways, and to give them that cohort of working together so you create a community within a much broader sense. That's what we're doing within community colleges across the US, and then enabling the students to transfer to the leading public and private colleges and universities across the country, and now increasingly looking to build international partnerships as well. And so our goal is to address those twin challenges I alluded to in the US system, namely, how do we lower the cost of getting a great degree, and how do we better prepare people so that they will succeed in completing their degree and then in the rest of their education and life. I think there are two ways in which American Honors might work here when we think about the UK context. One, if any of you are interested, we would love to look in the same way we've done with leading US places like UCLA or Amherst or Swarthmore to build pathways so that our students after 2 years could come and complete a degree at your universities in their final 2 years. But the other way, I think, is to think about, could this kind of model, as you heard in terms of thinking about foundation degrees and access, could it work more broadly here in the UK? I know many of you have had this with a local college of further education, but what we're trying to do with American Honors is say, whichever state you're in, whichever community college you go to, you ought to have access to the leading colleges and universities across the US. Could similar things happen here as you think about the next chapter of access? Could you build pathways that would allow students who maybe either aren't ready or can't afford to go locally or reluctant to take on the level of debt that we're now talking about in terms of the loan system here, begin locally and then end up at your universities? So I would love to talk about that more if you want in the discussion period. So I've talked about a lot of the forces that are changing higher ed. I think it's important at the same time to reflect on those things that may sustain the current model. What we know is that universities are the oldest institutions on the planet other than organized religion, and that they have had a very long life while corporations have come and gone. They produce many benefits beyond that of just new graduates. They are an anchor institution in their local economies. The demand for what they provide is at an all-time high, and delighted to hear about the surge that's continuing in participation here in the UK. And we see this particularly from bright students around the world. And as the OU's experience suggests here in Britain, I would argue that MOOCs, rather than being Clay Christensen's version of a disruptive force that will put universities out of business, are simply a new way that will serve other access. It will broaden things to people who otherwise don't have access to a good university. They will be a great resource to adult learners and the increasingly aging workforce as people think about how do they continue to reinvent their careers, to stay active intellectually throughout their lives. And they will change our traditional classroom practice, but I don't think we're going to see them become the alternative to coming to a university anytime soon for the majority of the school leaver population. The other thing that will, I think, sustain us for many years is the fact that in many professions, without a formal qualification from a university, you don't have access to a great career. But even there, we're seeing some really interesting innovation. So as part of the work I've done on India, wanted to point you to a very innovative model, the India School of Business. And what's interesting about this is it went from not existing prior to 1999 to today being the top-ranked business school in India. And the fascinating thing about that is they have become the go-to source for top management grads, and they don't offer a degree. The reason they don't offer a degree is because they didn't want to go through the approval system, which has a lot of strings attached to it in the Indian regulation of higher ed. They wanted to build the model they thought would best serve global corporations and leading Indian companies. And the way they were able to get the brand of quality is they partnered with places like Wharton, and the London Business School had many of their professors come and teach the initial classes. So they had great educational quality, and they had the board to die for of leading multinational corporations and Indian corporations who were hiring the graduates. So they had what individuals were looking for in a degree, and they offered something that looks very much like a world-leading MBA. They just didn't go through the process of getting it approved by the government. So the growth in international students, as we heard yesterday, offers a huge opportunity. Many of you are already actively engaged in this because the UK has been a true leader in this globally. It, as you see, has increased its market share while the US has seen a decline in its share, while the US remains the leader in terms of absolute numbers. But what we see is that this is an increasingly crowded competitive marketplace with Australia, with Canada, with Europe, and many countries around the world now for these bright students from around the world. So to conclude, what I think is vital for us as we think about what are the next challenges, what are the next opportunities for the UK and leading universities around the world, I think a key aspect of it is for the university to think about itself both as a local and a global institution. And so one of the things I was really encouraged by in listening to the minister yesterday was the fact that the city's portfolio and the higher ed and science portfolio are now being overseen by the same person. Because in the work that I've done on skill ecosystems and comparing leading clusters around the world like Silicon Valley and others that we've seen that are real sources of innovation, what you see is that at the heart of all of those are world-class universities. And so I think the fact that the government is thinking about those things together holds great promise for all of you. Because I think what we need to think about is, as this becomes a scarcer and scarcer commodity, we have to think about new revenue streams. How do we maximize the value of a great campus like this or a great cluster of higher ed institutions like you see in Leeds so that they are a center of social, cultural, and economic life of the cities that they inhabit? And yet at the same time, how do we think about leveraging new technology? How do we think about ourselves as an institution that can have an impact around the world, both through research, but also through our graduates, through our faculty, through service and other bases? I think there are a lot of unanswered questions as we look to this in going forward and think about these strategies. It's not clear how many big winners there will be in this global higher ed marketplace, which the brands will be and how they will emerge. What will happen in different sectors if the notion of having a degree becomes decoupled from getting a good job? I think this will play out very differently in different segments. Basically, any sector where it's easy to show that you're able, whether you're a computer programmer or a journalist, without having to rely on a set of assessments, I think the degree may become increasingly less important. Whereas in others where we see the professions regulating, like medicine, it's likely to remain more and more important going forward. What impact are MOOCs going to have as we look to the future? Well, as I've argued, I think they will be a complement rather than a replacement for our strategies. But I think what we will see is that new models emerging on the backs of them that will provide other supports like advising, like residential life, like other things that could leverage this content to deliver innovative educational experiences. And I think one of the things to keep an eye on as we go forward is also the emergence of new technologies and things like adaptive learning that are going to allow us to use what people are learning, give immediate feedback, and really accelerate the process. And I would point you to a couple of examples here worth keeping an eye on. One is the Khan Academy, which has become a truly global phenomenon in particularly math and science, education at the K through 12 level, but is now starting to move up into higher ed, and also at a company called Newton, which is adapting its technology to think about how can we provide that kind of customized feedback to different learning styles, to different types of individual progression. For the UK, I think you enter this sort of turbulent period in higher ed in a very, very strong way. You have a great foundation to build on. You have a policy-making apparatus that we would envy in the US, where I must say it's frustrating to go and see how hard it is to get any changes done. I think international students here are a huge net benefit to the economy, but it's going to be important to keep the policy environment one that makes it welcoming to it, and thinking about how can you address the next stage of challenges. So now you have about 40% of the population getting a degree. How do we think about serving that middle skill gap, where I know the government is focusing a lot of attention, whether it's through advanced apprenticeship, whether it's through more programs for adult learners, and expanding the ways we think about higher ed provision. So I wanted to just conclude it there, open it up for questions, and also urge you to think about, on the innovation side of what you do, what are the ways to stimulate the demand, the growth in the economy for new graduates, because I see that will be one of the central challenges that not just the UK, but all of the advanced industrial economies are going to be facing in the coming decades. So thank you very much.